The Middle East Conflict Made Simple by Steve Maltz. How many times have you been approached by someone and asked the question, so what do you think about what's happening in the Middle East? How frustrated have you been in your inability to string together a few coherent words, let alone a solid, robust argument to support your views? You're not alone. Hours of study and a PhD seem to be the minimum requirements here for a full understanding of the intricacies and subtleties of a situation that doesn't even have a history that people can agree on. There is nothing more confusing than the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Millions of words have been written and spoken about it, but how much of it has truly sunk in? How much of it has made sense? How much of it has been untainted by personal opinion or editorial slant? Jews and Zionists will tell you one thing, and Arabs and Arabists will tell you the opposite. Surely they can't both be right. Surely there can only be one truth, one set of proven historical events that can unravel the whole mess. Unfortunately, it isn't that straightforward. The situation is so complex, puzzling, and emotionally charged that it's well nigh impossible to get an objective viewpoint. It is exceedingly difficult to find historical sources with no axes to grind, commentators who would be accepted as truly impartial. Nevertheless, please indulge me while I try to unravel the mystery, sweep away the web of confusion, set my course for the heart of the matter, and try to make sense of it all. Let's go back to the 19th century and look at the lie of the land. Palestine, as it was called then, was a poor country ruled by absentee Turkish landlords as part of the crumbling and corrupt Ottoman Empire. First thing to notice is that Palestine was on both banks of the Jordan, the East Bank as well as the West Bank. It included the east part of the country now known as Jordan. That's an important point to make. Ancient Palestine had been for 1800 years, not just in the area currently known as Israel. Remember that point. By all accounts, the land was largely barren and uninhabited. Its population was either nomadic or largely involved with agriculture, despite the poor environment. Sir John William Dawson, writing in 1888, said, "No national union and no national spirit has prevailed there. The motley impoverished tribes which have occupied it have held it as mere tenants at will, temporary landowners, evidently waiting for those entitled to the permanent possession of the soil." Thanks to the Turks, the land had been totally neglected. Hundreds of years of abuse had turned the country into a treeless waste, with malaria-ridden swamps, a sprinkling of towns, and an unlivable desert in the south. This was the position in 1880, and this is incontestable fact. A final word here, from the author of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. According to the American author Mark Twain's independent eyewitness account in 1867, "Of all the lands there are for dismal scenery, I think Palestine must be the prince. It is a hopeless, dreary, heartbroken land. Palestine sits in sackcloth and ashes. Over it broods the spell of a curse that has withered its fields and fettered its energies. Nazareth is forlorn. About that ford of Jordan where the hosts of Israel entered the promised land with songs of rejoicing, one finds only a squalid camp of fantastic Bedouins of the desert. Jericho the accursed lies a mouldering ruin today, even as Joshua's miracle left it more than 3,000 years ago. Renowned Jerusalem itself, the stateliest name in history, has lost all its ancient grandeur and has become a pauper's village. Capernaum is a shapeless ruin. Magdala is the home of beggared Arabs. Bethsaida and Chorazin have vanished from the earth. Palestine is desolate and unlovely, and why should it be otherwise? Can the curse of the deity beautify a land? Palestine was not a country or a state in the manner of, say, an England or Germany at that time. It was simply a collection of villages. Although many Arabs did own their own homes, the majority were the poor fellahin who worked as hired hands for the landowners. There was no nationalism in the land, no feeling of belonging to a people. Loyalty was to the local clan or village. Arabs did not see themselves as Palestinians and often referred to their homeland as southern Syria. Jews had always lived in the land, right from biblical times, though in the 19th century they were very much a minority. The first major wave of Jewish immigration started in the 1880s. Land settled in by those first immigrants in the 1880s were bought from the absentee Turkish landlords, who were eager for the extra cash. The land initially settled in was the uncultivated, swampy, cheap and empty land. Later on they bought cultivated land, some of it at exorbitant prices. In his memoirs, King Abdullah of Jordan wrote, "The Arabs are as prodigal in selling their land as they are in useless wailing and weeping." The 19th century saw medieval backwardness gradually give way to the first signs of progress, with various Western powers jockeying for position, often through missionary activities. British, French and American scholars launched studies of biblical archaeology. Britain, France, Russia, Austria and the United States opened consulates in Jerusalem. Steamships began to ply regular routes to and from Europe. Postal and telegraphic connections were installed. The first road connection connecting Jerusalem and Jaffa was built. Consequently, the situation of the country's Jews slowly improved, and their numbers increased substantially. By mid-century, overcrowded conditions within the walled city of Jerusalem motivated the Jews to build the first neighbourhood outside the walls. By 1870, Jerusalem had an overall Jewish majority. Land for farming was purchased through the country, new rural settlements were established, and the Hebrew language was revived. The stage was set for the founding of the Zionist movement. But now we start to get discrepancies. How many people did live in the land at that time, and who were they? Well, by the end of the 19th century, the consensus is about 480,000. 432,000 Arab, 43,000 Jewish. And who were these Arabs? Arab sources simply say that these were indigenous people, Arabs who have lived in this land for generations. Jewish and independent sources say otherwise. They would point to immigrations from Egypt to escape heavy taxes, also Algeria, Turkey and elsewhere. There are suggestions that up to 25% of the Muslim population were immigrants. There was the foundation of the Jewish settlement of Rishon LeZion, where 40 Jewish families settled, followed later by more than 400 Arab families from Egypt and elsewhere. This was a community that worked and was at peace. The Arabs saw the benefits of what the Jews were doing to the land and joined them. Soon Jewish villages were springing up all over, and the towns of Jerusalem, Tiberias, Safed and Haifa started to grow. In 1909 they founded the first modern Jewish city, Tel Aviv. Between 1882 and 1914, pioneering Jews started slowly to transform the land. They worked on the swamps and the undrained rivers. Life was tough. If you didn't die of malaria, you could be killed by Bedouins. Attacks by Arab neighbours increased, even though, through the efforts of these Jewish pioneers, life for all in the land was improving, including for the Arab neighbours. The motivation for this new zeal for the land was the secular and political movement called Zionism, a desire to return to Zion, the name for this historic homeland of the Jewish people. Theodor Herzl was a Jewish atheist working as a journalist in France. Appalled at the anti-Semitism that he observed as the result of the Alfred Dreyfus case, he realised that even in the civilised countries of France and Germany, Jews were still viewed with suspicion. He wrote a book called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish State, as an expression of his political Zionism, his desire to see a modern Jewish state with a country, a flag and an identity. And of course there could be only one place for the realisation of this dream, Palestine, the historical land of Israel. Newspapers and other media sources today give the impression that Israel occupies land once owned by people living in a Palestinian state, but evidence is to the contrary. For a start, the Arabs in no way saw themselves as Palestinians. When the first Congress of Muslim Christian Associations met in Jerusalem in February 1919, the agreement was that we consider Palestine as part of Arab Syria. The only people who considered themselves Palestinians in the first half of the 20th century were the Jewish inhabitants. Even the Jewish national newspaper was called the Palestinian Post, now called the Jerusalem Post. And at the beginning of the 19th century, the London Jewish Society, one of the first missionary groups targeting the Jewish people in the world, had opened a building complex in Bethnal Green to act as their centre for missionary operations. They were thinking of a name for it. What did they come up with? Palestine Place. Interesting. Why would they have named their headquarters after a territory and a people with which they had absolutely no connection? Simple answer, it was because the only people at that time who mainly identified with the land of Palestine were the Jews. Let's go back to an important decade, the second decade of the 20th century, when a simple matter of immigration was made complex by political meddling, mainly, I'm afraid, by the British. 1916. The Sharif of Mecca was the Sheriff of Mecca, a position going back to the 13th century. One of the last men to hold this title was Hussein bin Ali of the Hashemite family, supposedly descended from Muhammad. He was a real mover and shaker in the Arab world at that time and not a friend of the Ottoman Turks. He was targeted by the British, who saw him as an ally against the Turks, who had sided with the Germans during the First World War. Sir Henry McMahon was the British High Commissioner in Egypt and corresponded by letter with the Sharif over the period of months. The British encouraged the Arabs to revolt and thus hamper the Ottoman Empire. The documents declared that the Arabs would revolt in alliance with the United Kingdom, and in return the UK would recognise Arab independence. Though significantly, no specific mention was made of Palestine in this secret agreement. This Arab revolt was made famous by the activities of Lawrence of Arabia, who came to their aid, fighting along Emir Faisal. A promise to the Arabs. Remember that. This promise was for an area running from the southern border of Turkey to be bounded in the east by Persia and the Persian Gulf, in the west by the Mediterranean Sea, and in the south by the Arabian Sea. A big area, a big promise. It's a shame the British never told the French, who also had major interests in the region. But they soon put that right, with more secret negotiations with the French as well as the Russians. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 was a secret agreement between the governments of the United Kingdom and France, with the agreement of Imperial Russia, defining their respective spheres of influence and control in the Middle East after the expected downfall of the Ottoman Empire during World War I. It effectively divided the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire peninsula into areas of future British and French control or influence. The terms were negotiated by the French diplomat Francois-Georges Picot and the British Sir Mike Sykes. Britain was allocated control of areas roughly comprising the coastal strip between the sea and the River Jordan, southern Iraq, and a small area including the ports of Haifa and Acre to allow access to the Mediterranean. France was allocated control of southeastern Turkey, northern Iraq, Syria and Lebanon. Russia was to get Constantinople, the Turkish Straits and the Armenian areas. The controlling powers were left free to decide on state boundaries within these areas. These were the European aspirations. And to make things even more embarrassing, the British had made other promises to the Jews. I'm sure you've all heard of the Balfour Declaration, the piece of play paper that gave official British recognition of the need for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Well, here is the man behind it. His full name was Arthur James Balfour, and he was the British Prime Minister in 1902. He wasn't very good at the job and was replaced in 1905, but bounced back when he became Foreign Secretary during the First World War. Politically, he had made many friends with influential Jews, such as Theodor Herzl, the first Zionist. His most significant friendship, though, was with Chaim Weizmann, the Jewish chemist and Lenin lookalike. When they met in 1914, Balfour stated that the Jewish question would remain insoluble until either the Jews here in Britain became entirely assimilated or there was a normal Jewish community in Palestine. In the meantime, Uganda was offered as a possible homeland for the Jews. This was rejected. Balfour asked Weizmann why Uganda was rejected and why were the Jews so hung up on Palestine. Weizmann responded by asking why the British were hung up on London. Balfour replied that the British currently had London, but the Jews did not have Jerusalem. Weizmann replied, "We had Jerusalem when London was a swamp." That was enough to persuade Balfour to begin to argue for Palestine for the Jews. The following is the content of a notice that would have appeared on the walls of classrooms and scout huts during World War I. Collecting groups are being organised in your district. Groups of scholars and Boy Scouts are being organised to collect conkers. Receiving depots are being opened in most districts. All schools are involved. Boy Scout leaders will advise you of the nearest depot where 7 6 per hundredweight is being paid for immediate delivery of the chestnuts without the outer green husks. This collection is invaluable war work and is very urgent. Please encourage it. So, the question arises, why did the War Department have the urgent need for conkers? As the First World War progressed, Weizmann made himself invaluable to the British war effort through his discovery of a process to produce synthetic acetone, a chemical needed to make cordite, a naval explosive. He cleverly discovered a process that made acetone from conkers, and that's how school kids did their bit for the war effort. His reward was the Balfour Declaration, contained within a letter to Lord Rothschild, the most prominent Jew of the day. Here is the letter. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's Government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's Government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I would be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours sincerely, Arthur James Balfour. And these were the Jewish aspirations. And here is the Palestine, the area that he was talking about. There was a Jew and an Arab, and they actually got along with each other. The Jew, Chaim Weizmann, and the Arab was Emir Faisal, the son of the Sharif of Mecca, the Hashemite who was making secret agreements with the British just a few years earlier, and who actually endorsed the Balfour Declaration at the official peace conference at the end of World War I. They met at the end of 1918. The interpreter was Lawrence of Arabia, and the first thing they did was dismiss the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the meddlings of Britain and France. Then Weizmann explained his demands. The rights of Jews to live in Palestine under British trusteeship, allowing for up to 5 million Jews to immigrate, with Arabs looked after and Muslim holy places respected. The basis for the agreement was the Balfour Declaration. Faisal agreed, and they signed the agreement. What they didn't allow for was the meddling of the European colonial powers, who were seeking their reward for removing the Ottoman Turks. Because the British and the French thwarted Faisal's plans for an independent Arab Middle East, this agreement was eventually rendered irrelevant, and even though the Arab countries did eventually become independent. If only. One interesting aside was a letter written from by Sykes to Faisal. I know that the Arabs despise, condemn and hate the Jews, but passion is the ruin of princes and peoples. Those who have persecuted or condemned the Jews could tell you the tale. The Empire of Spain in the old days and the Empire of Russia in our time show the road of ruin that Jewish persecution leads to. You say to yourself, what is this race, despised, rejected, abhorred, that cannot fight, that has no home and is no nation? O Faisal, I can read your heart and your thought, and there are counsellors about you who will whisper similar things in your ear. Believe I speak the truth when I say that this race, despised and weak, is universal, is all-powerful, and cannot be put down. Interesting. So the Europeans convened a conference at San Remo, Italy, to make sense of all the promises that had been made in the previous decade by the British. By this time, Faisal had fallen out with the Europeans. The British were moving away from sympathy for the Jews, and the Arabs in places like Jerusalem were starting to revolt, frightened at the thought of a massive influx of Jews. David Lloyd George represented the Brits. Faisal wasn't there, and Weizmann came in a dispirited mood, particularly as the issue of Palestine was quite low on the agenda. Syria had already been created as a new nation, with Palestine as a province of South Syria. Faisal had been put in charge before the French kicked him out and decided to rule the place directly. They decided to incorporate the Balfour Declaration and produce what was known as the Palestinian Mandate, which passed over to Britain to govern. Here was the preamble. Whereas the principal Allied powers have also agreed that the mandatory should be responsible for putting into effect the declaration originally made on November the 2nd, 1917 by the government of His Britannic Majesty and adopted by the said powers in favour of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, it being clearly understood that nothing should be done which might prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. The outcome of the declaration gave birth to this Mandate for Palestine, an historical League of Nations document that laid down the Jewish legal right to settle anywhere in Western Palestine. More of this in a minute. At 10,000 square miles, the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. This was a legal document, an expression of international law. More of this later. So, the thrice promised land. Britain made 3 promises to the Arabs, to the French, and to the Russians, and to the Jews. McMahon-Hussein correspondence with the Arabs, Sykes-Picot proposal with the French and the Russians, and the Balfour Declaration to the Jews. Thrice promised land. 1922. Remember when I mentioned Western Palestine as a home for the Jews? Well, where did that come from? Well, Article 25 of the Palestinian Mandate gave a bit of a leeway for the British to do what they liked over the area to the east of the River Jordan. They weren't obliged to offer that to the Jews too, so they didn't. Instead, they gave away 78% of the land through the Transjordan Memorandum to one of the sons of the Sharif of Mecca, Abdullah. The first king, Hussein of Transjordan, and Iraq was given to his other brother, Faisal. In this way, the McMahon-Hussein correspondence was honoured within the framework of the Sykes-Picot proposal by diluting the Balfour Declaration, if you can see what I mean. And the man who presented this proposal to the League of Nations, it was Lord Balfour himself. How interesting. So in this way, Palestine was broken up into 2 regions, divided by the River Jordan. Transjordan, ruled by the Hashemite King Abdullah in the east, and Palestine to the west, now a smaller Palestine as when it was in the previous century. And so the Palestinian Mandate becomes the British Mandate for Palestine, a legal commission for the administration of Palestine, or West Palestine, as instigated by the San Remo Conference and the League of Nations. Let's remember that preamble. Remember, talking about the declaration originally made on November the 2nd, 1917, that's the Balfour Declaration, and the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. The priority here was meant to be the well-being of the Jewish people. The fact that the British betrayed them is documented in Hugh Kitson's film The Forsaken Promise. So I won't cover it here, but it's an awful, poignant and important story. In the 20th century, Arabs, as well as Jews, were immigrating into Palestine, mainly from Egypt, Transjordan, Syria and Lebanon. And between 1922 and 1931, illegal Arab immigrants comprised almost 12% of the Arab population. The Hope Simpson report acknowledged in 1930 that there was uncontrolled influx of illegal immigrants from Egypt, Transjordan and Syria. The rate of immigration increased during the early 1930s, which was a period of prosperity in Palestine. The Syrian government, the governor of Horan, admitted in 1934 that 30,000 to 36,000 people from his district entered Palestine that year and settled there. In 1939, Winston Churchill said, "Far from being persecuted, the Arabs have crowded into the country and multiplied until their population has increased more than even all world Jewry could lift up. Increase the Jewish population." This is important, though much contested point, because it dispels the myth that the Palestinian people have lived there for generations. When we talk about Palestinian refugees displaced as a result of the formation of the State of Israel, consider how many of them would have been as recent to the land as the Jews themselves. Between 1936 and 1939 there was a general uprising by the Arabs in Palestine against the British rulers and the Jewish immigration. In all, the British killed more than 2,000 Arabs in combat, with 108 hanged and 961 killed as a result of terrorist and gang behaviour, whatever that meant. But it led to a royal commission, the Peel Commission, headed by the Earl Peel. Weizmann spoke up for the Jews. The Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, testified and opposed any concessions to the Jews. making unfounded statements about Jewish land purchases which were proved to be false by the Commission. But it recommended the end of the mandate, except in an international corridor linking Jerusalem to the coast, and separate regions for Arabs and Jews, facilitating big movements of populations. The Arabs rejected this, but the Jews felt that it was just the first stage in a longer process. Ironically, as Ben-Gurion later stated, if this had been carried out, perhaps many of the 6 million Jews of the Holocaust could have been saved. In 1939, Britain at a conference in London suggested a new partition, proposing an Arab-dominated state with 75,000 Jews allowed in it by 1944, and where subsequently the Arabs could decide how many Jews to let in. Amazingly, the Arabs rejected this too. Yet the 75,000 quota was adhered to, a tragic state of affairs considering what was now beginning to happen in Europe. In 1942, a ship with 769 Jewish refugees was refused landing permission in Haifa and later sank. Then there was another ship, the Exodus, in 1947, where the British refused 4,500 immigrants, sending them back ultimately to holding camps in Germany of all places. Through these actions, Britain was vilified by world opinion, particularly now that the horrors of the Holocaust had been uncovered. It was also totally fed up with the terrorism of both the Arab and Jewish extremists, and finally decided that enough was enough. Besides, it was having enough problems of its own, holding together the ailing and crumbling British Empire. So, they handed over the problem to be sorted out by the newly formed United Nations. What was proposed was a partitioning of the land into 3 portions: an Arab state, a Jewish state, and an international area based around Jerusalem. The Jewish state was to be a strange, twisted area, lassoed at 2 points and destined to be the ugliest looking piece of geography on the map. The Arab state fared little better, being the photographic inverse of the Jewish state, except for a large hole in the middle, the international area. Only a committee could have come up with such a hodgepodge. On November the 29th, 1947, the General Assembly of the United Nations met to see what the nations felt about this. The place: United Nations General Assembly. The occasion: voting to decide on the United Nations partition plan to create a Jewish state and an Arab state. 57 nations voted. Naturally, the Muslim countries, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Turkey, Yemen and Afghanistan, voted against the plan, not wanting any official declaration of a Jewish nation in their midst. Britain, to its shame, considering its century-old relationship with the Jews, abstained. Wounded pride at its failure in the area. Its desire to cultivate relationships with their Arab friends was a contributory factor here. The biggest mystery concerned the attitude of Russia, which actually saw the Jewish Zionists with their socialist leanings as the potential ally in the Middle East. So Russia and its allies joined with Europe and most of the free world and voted for the partition plan. Without this unexpected support, the United Nations partition plan would never have been accepted, as it needed a 2/3 majority to be carried through. It was carried through, and the State of Israel was born into the international community. Also notice that Transjordan was renamed Jordan at this time too. But the birth was not an easy one. We fast forward to May the 14th, 1948, the date of the declaration of the State of Israel. A nation was born. The odds were 200 to 1. 7 Arab nations with populations of over 140 million against one fledgling Jewish nation with 650,000 people. The Arabs were driven by hatred and pride, the Jews driven by the need for survival and the desire to put the Holocaust behind them. The Jews had the backing not from any other country. The Arabs had, among other advantages, a British-sponsored army called the Arab Legion. Israel was fighting on 4 fronts: Transjordan to the east, Syria and Lebanon to the north, Iraq and Syria to the northeast, and Egypt in the south. It was 1948, and this was Israel's War of Independence. The Jews had little military equipment, especially arms and munitions. At times, 2 soldiers had to share a single rifle. During the war, they used weapons foraged and specially created, such as improvised armoured cars and Molotov cocktails. They also had a mixture of small arms left over from World War II, light artillery and machine guns, some anti-tank bazookas and jeeps and half-tracks with mounted machine guns. The Arab armies, on the other hand, were heavily armed with the latest equipment from Britain. The war lasted about 8 months, punctuated by the occasional truce. The Israeli victory was such that only a quick intervention by British delegates in the United Nations saved the Arabs from a more disastrous defeat. The war that was provoked by the Arabs to annihilate the State of Israel not only brought a pride-thrashing defeat for them, but rewarded the Israelis with an increase of more than 40% of new land. Over and above that promised them through the United Nations partition plan, including West Jerusalem. It was only thanks to the effectiveness of Sir John Glubb and his Arab Legion that the Israelis didn't take the whole of Jerusalem, including the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism. We now have the major point of contention, the Palestinian refugees. But there were not one but two refugee situations created. Just under 750,000 Arabs, that's a UN estimate, lost their homes. These became the Palestinian refugees. They lost their homes through two main reasons. Some were driven out by the Jewish or the Israeli army. Others fled after being told to do so by Arab army commanders, expecting an eventual victory, i.e. the Jews driven out of the land, at which time people could return to their homes. Apart from extremists on either side, people generally accept these as the main reasons, though the proportions, i.e. what percentage were driven out or told to leave, would vary wildly depending on your viewpoint. Up until 1948, Jews had lived in most of the Arab Muslim countries of the Middle East. In most cases, they'd been there over 1,000 years, before Islam even existed. From 1947, hundreds of Jews in Arab lands were massacred in government-organised rioting, leaving thousands injured and millions of dollars in Jewish property destroyed. In 1948, Jews were forcibly ejected from Iraq, Egypt, Libya, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Tunisia, Morocco and Algeria, who confiscated property from the fleeing Jews worth tens of billions in today's dollars. Of the 820,000 Jewish refugees created by this situation, 590,000 were absorbed by Israel. Now we get to the real point. All the facts presented so far are from an endlessly contested history. People have argued about these facts until the cows come home and have got nowhere in the process. So I'm now going to ask you to move on from the murkiness of endless debate and into the light of certainties. And the certainty is as clear-cut as they come. You can witness it with your very eyes. It is a fact that cannot be contested. Palestinian refugees still exist, in camps, on the West Bank, in Lebanon and elsewhere. Have you wondered why? The 820,000 Jewish refugees who were forcibly ejected from Arab countries, where they had often lived for thousands of years, were welcomed and integrated into Israel or the Jewish world elsewhere. There are no Jewish refugee camps. The 750,000 Arab refugees who were displaced in 1948 were placed into squalid refugee camps by fellow Arabs who had just gone to war and lost on their behalf but were unwilling to pay for the consequences. Incredibly, over 60 years later, over 1 million of these poor people are still in these camps, despite billions of dollars of relief paid by rich Arab states, the United Nations, the EU and others. Where on earth has this money gone, and why on earth are they still in camps and not integrated into Arab society? Palestinian Arabs are no doubt a peaceful, welcoming and gifted people, but they have been the greatest victims of the whole sorry affair, pawns in a wider struggle orchestrated by their powerful Arab brethren. For reasons known only to their political and religious masters, they have lived for 2 or 3 generations within the bounds of these camps. Isn't a refugee camp meant to be a temporary home, as it has been for millions of refugees in other situations, until the people could be relegated to homes of their own? Not so here. Just look at those figures. This is in January 2010. There's still almost 2 million in Jordan. Incredible. Over 1 million in the Gaza Strip. Palestinians were never allowed to be ordinary refugees. They have been kept in a form of forced captivity for a sinister purpose. A purpose that has succeeded in transforming a peace-loving, gentle people into terrorist pariahs, and has produced an atmosphere where it is considered holy and noble to send your children out as living weapons of destruction to blow up other children. Let's be honest here and consider who is really responsible for this tragedy. It is not Israel. Can't they see who their real enemy is? But they've lost their homeland, you may say. But yes, this is true. Though, as I have suggested, many would have been recent immigrants to the land rather than having lived there for generations, as suggested by the propaganda. And of course they were surrounded by oil-rich neighbours who shared their race, culture and religion. A homeland in Jordan, for example, would have been perfectly possible and logical. Then of course the Jews themselves, over the last 3,000 years, have been relocated more times than you could count. This is a good place to stop, regroup and summarise. This is because it's important to get our heads around what is the most contentious and argued fact: who really owns the land. The Palestinians to this day call the events of 1948 the Nakba, the catastrophe. The day many Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes. We will never know the exact numbers, but here's a telling quote from a Palestinian website. It concedes that about half probably left out of fear and panic, which is a grudging concession to the Jewish view. The quote continues, while the rest were forced out to make room for Jewish immigrants from Europe and from the Arab world. But who owns the land, legally? According to international law, the only relevant legislation was that provided by the 51 member countries of the League of Nations, and then inherited by the United Nations, the Mandate for Palestine. We saw it before, all based on the Balfour Declaration. It still hasn't been superseded or nullified, and remember, the area covered by this mandate then included not just the West Bank, but also the present country of Jordan. And what about the West Bank, or the occupied West Bank as it's more often known? It is true that Israel occupied the land since gaining it as a result of the victory in the Six-Day War in 1967. More of that later. But who did they occupy it from? Well, believe it or not, the West Bank itself was illegally seized by Jordan in 1950. Only Britain recognised this act, even other Arab countries didn't. Jordan offered citizenship to the Palestinian refugees. Then, if so, why didn't they resettle them? Interesting. After doing so, they made it an area forbidden to Jews. Can you imagine the fuss there would be if Israel adopted this same attitude with Arab settlers? Jews couldn't even visit the Western Wall, their holiest place. Can you imagine if the Israelis stopped Muslims from visiting the Dome of the Rock? It was June 1967. God rested on the seventh day and was pleased with his creation. The Israelis similarly had much to be pleased about on their seventh day. 7 days earlier they looked south and saw Egyptian tanks at the border with a blockade on Israeli shipping. To the north, Syria was bombarding Israeli villages from the Golan Heights. To the east, Jordan and Iraq were gnashing their teeth, ready and waiting. War had not been officially declared, but you'd hardly believe it. The airwaves around Israel were full of the boasting rhetoric of Arab nations vying with each other to be the first to liberate Palestine. Nasser, the Egyptian leader, declared a jihad, a holy war against the infidel Israel. Israel was outnumbered 5-1 in troops, 3-1 in tanks, and nearly 3-1 in combat aircraft. Like schoolyard bullies, her enemies postured and posed, growling and threatening trouble. But the Israelis hadn't read the script, especially as it was written in Arabic in blood, but they clinically unleashed one of the most decisive battle plans in military history. On June the 5th, Israel attacked. It destroyed almost all of Egypt's air force, the largest in the Middle East, in 3 hours. Most aircraft hadn't even taken off. To all intents and purposes, the war was over. From then on, confusion and fear reigned in the Arab forces. By the end of the week, Israel had captured the Sinai and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and the rest of Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. Israel had increased its size by an incredible 300%. The historian Cecil Roth later described the Six-Day War as perhaps the most brilliant campaign in military history. The Israeli army had shown itself the best fighting force in the world. And the truly interesting fact concerns Jerusalem. Jerusalem wasn't included in the original UN partition plan agreed by the Jews. Yet, they took the western part of it as spoils of war in the War of Independence. Also, knowing that any battle for Jerusalem would be costly, the Israeli leadership tried to come to a compromise with Jordan over it during the Six-Day War. But Jordan refused, having been confused by a false report that Egypt had destroyed the Israeli Air Force. So, the Israelis took the whole of Jerusalem. after the heaviest fighting of the war, it seemed that Jerusalem was being coaxed into Jewish hands by fate, providence, or dare we say, through a miracle of God. In 1970, Jordan was reaping what it had sown. In creating a people held in a state of deprivation and hatred, it failed to realize that what they had created might rise up and bite them. In Palestinian enclaves and refugee camps in Jordan, the Jordanian police and army were losing their authority. Uniformed PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization militants openly carried weapons, set up checkpoints, and attempted to extort taxes. They had created a monster, culminating in Black September, when 5,000 Palestinians were killed by fighting with the Jordanian army. The PLO were henceforth kicked out of the country to Lebanon. We move on to 1973. So you want miracles? Then read on. The following extracts have been taken from a book, Battle for Israel, by Lance Lambert, an English Jew who was living in Israel at the time of this war. The Yom Kippur War should have been the annihilation of the State of Israel. People think of the 1967 Six-Day War as a miracle, but it was nothing compared with the Yom Kippur War. And in the years that lie ahead, when the whole truth comes out, we shall see that it was beyond all reason that Israel was not annihilated. He goes on to remark that at one point in the war, only 90 battered Israeli tanks stood between the powerful Egyptian army and Tel Aviv, and that both Egypt and Syria could have beaten Israel but were inexplicably prevented. Two episodes stand out. The first Egyptian tank division that crossed over the canal had nothing to prevent it, and the ones that followed behind from advancing into central Israel. Yet it stopped, inexplicably. To the north of Israel, the Syrians poured out of the Golan Heights, yet when they got within sight of the Israeli HQ and the Sea of Galilee, they were mysteriously halted. What made this story incredible was that the HQ was manned by just 10 men and 2 tanks. The Yom Kippur War was an all-out attack on Israel by Egypt and Syria that took the country completely by surprise, not only because it happened on the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, but because for the first time the military and the defence establishment were totally unprepared. Unlike the Six-Day War, this time Israel started out at a complete and utter disadvantage, with the element of surprise, helped by Soviet spy satellites, used against them. Yet, just like the other war and all other preceding conflicts, the outcome was totally in her favour. At the start of the war, the world looked on, seemingly indifferent, preparing their best suits and mourning dresses for Israel's funeral. The United Nations held back for reasons that were all about politics, rather than intervening out of compassion for a fledgling country barely 25 years old. But wait, another miracle. Israel didn't read the script, because very soon, against all the odds, she began to throw back the invading forces. She was near to the gates of Damascus, the capital of Syria, and had surrounded the Egyptian Third Army in the south, with Cairo in her sights. The United Nations was unprepared for this. It had already prepared the eulogy for the death of a brave nation, and it wasn't expecting such territorial aggression by the Zionist imperialists. It was incensed and immediately voted for a ceasefire, before Israel completely rewrote the map of the Middle East. Despite that, there was no appreciable change in territory. It was a great victory, but a costly one for Israelis. $7 billion in money and 2,688 in lives, with over 7,000 wounded. Although the Arab losses were far greater in numbers proportionally to the size of the nation, these figures were a disaster for Israel. Very few families survived the war without having to mourn a personal loss. 1978 was the first big peace conference held in the USA, with Begin and Sadat, who both get Nobel Peace Prizes, and Jimmy Carter, who didn't. Perhaps that's why he's such an opponent of Israel these days. As a result of this conference, Sinai was returned to Egypt for a peace treaty that is still holding, shakily. Land for peace. Sadat was assassinated 3 years later. 1987 signalled the start of a 6-year uprising in the Palestinian territories, the first Intifada. This was the era of the stone-throwing kids against the heavily armoured evil Israelis. The media had a field day. It is also infamous for the founding of Hamas in Gaza. Although 164 Israelis were killed, many more Palestinians met their death, almost as many at the hands of their own people, killed mainly for collaborating with the enemy. 1988. Yasser Arafat and the PLO, languishing in Tunis after being kicked out of Jordan and Lebanon, had an idea to declare the state of Palestine with Jerusalem as capital, even though they did not own an inch. It was a deliberate provocation, and the sad thing was that 75 world states recognised this. Arafat declared himself president. Also, the UN now officially recognised the name Palestine rather than PLO. Interestingly, the legal basis quoted for this proclamation was the Lausanne Treaty of 1923, which had nothing directly to do with Palestine, and of course made no mention of the Palestinian Mandate of 1922, the only legal basis which gave the whole area on both sides of the Jordan to the Jews. 1993. We had the Oslo Accords. Here are the representatives. It was the first face-to-face agreement between Israel and the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, and gave concessions of land and self-determination for the Palestinians to be implemented gradually over a few years. It marked the end of the Intifada. 2000. When Oslo had run its course, we had the Clinton-sponsored Camp David summit. It was extremely ambitious, aiming to settle some big issues once and for all. Israel offered most of the West Bank and all of Gaza. It was rejected by Arafat. Israel offered some concessions over Jerusalem. It was rejected by Arafat. Israel offered direct action over the refugees. It was rejected by Arafat. Did they really want to solve the refugee problem? All Israel asked for was security. Guess who was blamed for its failure? Yasser Arafat. So, to deflect attention, Arafat arranged the Second Intifada, another uprising not sparked off by Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount. Many more were killed, and it didn't end until Arafat's end. By the way, after his death, it was found that he had squirreled away over $1 billion of Palestinian funds into private portfolios and offshore funds. 2005. Land for Peace again. This time Ariel Sharon gave Gaza away. There was also a partial withdrawal from the West Bank, but no peace came. The rockets still flew, soldiers were kidnapped, etc., and Gaza was taken over by the extreme Palestinian group, who totally rejected the validity of the Israeli state. And Sharon left the scene shortly after, despite all he had done for the state of Israel earlier. 2007, the Annapolis Conference, another USA-sponsored peace conference at the US Naval Academy. It was the first time a two-state solution was proposed, a Palestinian state alongside Israel, and it was approved by the UN. As it involved concessions over Jerusalem, some parts of East Jerusalem would be given to the Palestinians, many opposed, including Christian groups as well as Jewish groups. Iran and Hamas opposed for other reasons. Hate. 2011. The UN vote on the Palestinian state. Here's how the voting went. It needed 9 votes to carry, but it got 8. UK abstained, as usual. On the 15th of December 2011, Iceland recognised Palestine as an independent and sovereign state within the pre-67 Six-Day War borders. And we can see, as of the 18th of January 2012, 130 of the 193 member states of the United Nations have recognised the state of Palestine. And also on the 31st of October 2011, the General Council of UNESCO voted in favour of admitting Palestine as a member state. And the Palestinian flag was raised for the first time at UNESCO headquarters in Palestine, in Paris. Summary. Villains. The UK. Why? Secret promises to Arabs and Jews while plotting with the French. Remember, the thrice given land. Scaling down the borders of Palestine to appease Arab leaders. Remember when they created Transjordan? Creating nation states to appease the local people who they let down on other issues. This included Jordan, Iraq, Syria. The forsaken promises of the British Mandate started off with good intentions but watered down and eventually forgotten. Never voting for Israel at the UN, usually abstaining. The only country to recognise Jordan's illegal annexing of the West Bank in the 1950s. Other villains. Arab leaders. Rejection of the UN partition plan. Subsequent invasion of Israel, that was a big mistake. Instigation of riots against Jews from 1920s onwards, matter of history. The belligerence to Israel in 1967, causing the preemptive strike of the Six-Day War. Refusal to put the well-being of Palestinians ahead of the hatred of Israel, keeping them as refugees. That's the biggest sadness of all. General intransigence at peace summits. The victims. Two victims. The Jews and the Palestinians. Just to be allowed to live their lives in peace and security. That's all both people really at their heart want and have always wanted. Finally, present day Middle East and North Africa. Interesting to know that if the 5 richest Arabs in the whole world were to put all their money together, they would have enough money to solve the Palestinian refugee situation, to rehouse all those still living in camps. And that would go, and obviously there would be other consequences, positive ones, one would hope. But that hasn't happened. Displaced people the world over are allowed to resettle. Why not the Palestinians, especially as their fellow Arabs are among the richest people on the planet, with hundreds of square miles of spare room? You can see that on the map. Finally, why is Muslim hatred for the Jews so much greater than the compassion for their own people? Where can we find the answer to this question? Interesting. And that's all for this short presentation. I hope you have found it enjoyable. If you want any more information, just go to the website, which is www.sppublishing.com. www.sppublishing.com. I hope you enjoyed this. See you again. Goodbye.